Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I've looked at about 178 different studies, and they're in a variety of different areas, psychology, neuroscience, education, and I've tried to piece together what is the science, if there be any, behind some of the very popular fears and mistrusts about digital technology. This is a very important thing for me as well, because I understand and I do empathize with the concerns that parents often feel about this new world that our children find themselves in, completely immersed, heading towards a 24/7 technology world. One of the things that we hear is that our love of the latest technology could be turning into a 21st century addiction, that Facebook is infantilizing our brains, turning us into little children, unable to communicate properly, and that Google is degrading our intelligence. Well, I'm going to start off with the first claim, that search engines and the ability to access and use the internet is actually taking something away from us in neural terms. And one of the studies, one of the very few studies actually, scientific studies, that has fed this idea was carried out by Gary Small and colleagues. And what Gary did was to ask a set of participants, some of which were naive users of the internet that hardly ever used it, and another group that were actually quite experienced at using it, to use a search engine and also to read a book. And he compared which regions of the brain were more active when using the internet compared with reading a book. And what we can see is that for naive users, there was some increase in activity in occipital regions, occipital temporal regions. But for the experienced users, those people who spent quite a few years Googling, we see a completely different picture. We see lots of different regions of activity. It would appear that experience with Google, experience with a search engine, has changed these people's brains. This is probably just about learning. Whenever we learn, there are changes that occur in our brains. The brain is plastic. And what we're seeing here is a study of learning where adults have practiced difficult multiplication tasks. On the left picture, we see where brain activity has decreased. And those regions tend to be associated with working memory. It's our ability to hold things in our attention. And we use working memory a lot when we're first learning to do something. We have to remember what we've been told. We have to remember the mistakes we made last time, not to listen to our distracting colleague next to us or whatever. All these things place a burden on our working memory. But when we've actually practiced our task and we have learned, then that load on the working memory decreases, and instead we have increase in activity in more posterior regions, what we can see in the right image, which corresponds to regions associated with automaticity. So there's a shift in activity from frontal to posterior regions for this particular type of learning. But actually, there's no one place in the brain where we learn. These changes can occur in different ways for all different types of learning tasks. But learning is always associated with changes in the brain, changes in the connections between neurons, and quite often these sorts of shifts in regional activity. So when we go back to these images now, we may see them in a different way. What we have here are people in the right image who have learnt to use Google. They are probably using the search engine in a different way. These experienced users are probably using more search strategies. They have different types of targets, a set of targets, more complex decision-making processes are in order. So yes, using the internet rewires our brains. Should we be concerned? No, I don't think so. All of experience, when it becomes a learning experience, rewires our brains to some extent. Now, I said that the brain is plastic, but I have to admit that some brains are more plastic than others. And children's brains are more plastic than adults. But in this world where these children with their more plastic brains are immersed in this digital world, this wasn't my childhood. And it's right for us to be asking questions because these individuals are more sensitive to these new environments. And research in the 1990s showed, for example, that greater internet use was linked to reduced social connectedness and well-being. That might be of concern. The more time you spend on the internet, according to this research, the more socially isolated you are, the more likelihood is that you will suffer from poor psychosocial well-being. And maybe this is behind some of these concerns that Facebook is somehow infantilizing us and holding back our social development. And yet we have to ask ourselves, what was a digital teenager in the 1990s like? What were they actually doing? I'm talking about text-only websites. I'm talking about floppy disks that were big and that were really floppy. So perhaps it's not surprising that teenagers who were very committed to this type of quite remote experience were also more connected with social issues. In other words, the more time that children spent on the internet in those years was connected with more of these social problems. But also, many of their friends were not on the internet. Very few teenagers were actually connected back in the 1990s. So this was not a matter of using the internet to support their existing social network. Now we find the research is telling us very clearly that social network sites generally stimulate teenage social connectedness and psychosocial well-being. If you are using social network sites and you're a teenager, you're more likely to have a healthier social life and you're more likely to be happier as a person. That's what the research is telling us. Now, I'm not pretending that there aren't issues involved with social network sites. Cyberbullying and certain types of abuse do occur. However, they seem to be linked usually to issues that are beyond the technology itself. In other words, if somebody is prone to being bullied on the internet, it is quite likely they're also being bullied in the classroom. It suggests that children need to be protected from these things using the same skills of awareness and avoidance as they would use in their offline world. But it is also, and this is a big caveat, how the technology is being used. Because yes, social network sites are connected to positive social outcomes, provided they're being used to support existing friendships. Teenagers who are using it to make a lot of new friends that they haven't had before, people that they haven't met before face to face, that is usually connected to a whole set of other issues which can be negative. That is not the normal way that it is being used. So we keep coming back to this idea of, is the internet bad for us? If we can go back to fire, the most ancient of our technologies, we know it's good for many things. It's good for warmth, it's good for toasting muffins and doing our cooking. But it's very bad, though, if you use it carelessly. We don't see panicky headlines saying fire may destroy us, because we've come to understand the dangers and the precautions. And we are beginning to understand those about digital technology as well. And a lot of it does derive from common sense. Chiefly, it's about how we use the technology, not about the technology itself. Technology itself is neither good nor bad. It's how we use it, when we use it, how much we use it, what for. Different types of technology are likely to affect your sleep patterns in different ways. And perhaps you should be aware that small bright screens have been linked to a delay in melatonin secretion. So in fact, they are more likely to disrupt your sleep than, for example, television screens. And there is some evidence to suggest that this is a problem, particularly amongst teenagers. Teens who text after lights out are 4 times more likely to suffer from daytime sleepiness. And there is also the issue that disturbed sleep will not just disturb the amount of energy you have and how sleepy you feel the next day. Sleep is very important for consolidating memory. And here you can see the images above where the activity during wakeful hours preceding sleep are actually being reproduced in the brain during sleep as part of this consolidation process. If you interrupt sleep, you are likely to interrupt learning. We know the internet, as well as if it's used wrongly, can cause problems. It can also heal problems. And a review of 22 studies of computerized cognitive behavioral therapy recently concluded that this was an effective, acceptable, and practical healthcare option, particularly for those who otherwise would remain untreated, and especially when it was delivered via the internet. And the internet can also teach. I mean, apart from the myriad of resources that schools are now using, it also allows you to communicate in a way that's never been before possible. It's also, of course, about how much you use it. There has been often hypothesized a link between too much internet use and a lack of exercise, which of course is great concern to us in these days of obesity. But actually the data, when you look at the research, is very mixed on this. There are some studies that do show a negative effect. The more you use the internet, the less exercise you take. And there are also studies that actually show the opposite. For some reason, the more internet use you're indulging in, the more exercise you're taking. And I think a study by Atwell actually provides some insight into this, because it's about whether it's disrupting your day-to-day normal routines. That is the point at which internet use becomes problematic. And Atwell found that if it was no more than 8 hours per week, there was really no impact on exercise at all. And of course, we're not talking about here, I don't think we're talking about internet at school or internet for homework, we're talking about leisure time internet. So I seem to be saying that in almost all respects, there's no evidence of digital technology's special influence on the brain. To a large extent, this is true. I think that well-being in our new digitized environment is really about transferring a lot of our offline everyday wisdom into this new world. Choosing activities with obvious benefit, moderating, and making sure we have a variety of activities. And for children, it's been suggested by the Academy, the American Academy of Pediatricians, that 2 hours of entertainment screen time, that's TV plus entertainment on the internet, video games, whatever, is a sensible maximum time for children per day. Scientists have found at least one way in which we can improve our basic cognitive function. I mean, this is a very attractive idea. All of our education and our performance in our work relies upon us using basic cognitive functions like attention, memory. If we could train those, then you can imagine knock-on effects in all sorts of different ways if we could train those primary basic functions. And in terms of working memory, scientists are beginning to achieve this, and this is quite exciting. I mean, for example, the task on the left, people are being presented with a different visual stimulus every few seconds. And every now and then, they're being stopped and they're being asked, is this the same as 2 back? And if they get it right, then it will probably become more difficult. Next time, they might be asked 3 back. If you train people to do this half an hour a day, and we're talking about young adults, then not only does it improve their working memory ability, but it also improves their fluid intelligence, their ability to apply what they know to new situations. Fluid intelligence is the best predictor we have of academic and professional performance. However, in all other respects, brain training has been something of a disaster. Scientists all over the world have been struggling in their basement labs trying to find ways of doing this. The journals are full of myriads of papers of efforts that have failed. It appears that other types of cognitive or brain training, if you want to call it, do not transfer to new tasks. So they get better at what you're practicing, but actually it doesn't transfer to anything else, certainly not to the real world. Meanwhile, in lounges, front rooms, and bedrooms all over the world, thanks to a particular type of technology, young people and many adults have been experiencing increased performance on many visual motor tasks, ones that require visual decisions, visual attention and response times, switching of their visual attention from one thing to the next, improvements in their ability to suppress distracting visual influences, an improvement in their ability to infer an action's probable outcome in a very short period of time. What is this thing, this type of technology that has been bringing about these improvements? Action video games. It appears that just 10 hours of play for non-gamers, people who wouldn't normally touch the things, can generate transferable benefits to other tasks. Longitudinal studies have been able to track improvements in these skills in relation to gameplay. And there haven't been many studies undertaken, but these effects even transfer to some professional activities. The Israeli Defense Force now insist that their trainee pilots indulge in action video games. And we recently heard from military spokesmen from the US saying that their best drone pilots were those who indulge in action video games. What is going on inside the brain for this to happen? Well, let's go back to that statistic. What are those people who are obsessed with the internet actually doing? Well, if they're adults, either looking at pornography, sadly, or having illicit relationships. I'm pleased to say that the young people do better than that. They're actually indulging in gaming. That is the number one interest of your obsessive internet user if they're a young person. Why is this? Well, games, like many pleasures, sex, food, and music, stimulate the brain's reward system. But in video games, we have very rapid schedules of rewards, which are not very easily found in any other type of activity. And we know from studies such as COEPS that these stimulate the midbrain regions. Why is it important that the rewards are uncertain? Well, we love uncertain rewards. Now, this is actually an experiment with a monkey that demonstrates why that is. The amount of dopamine being released in the midbrain region of this monkey is being measured in relation to stimuli that it sees on the screen. Now, in the past, some of these stimuli have been associated with getting a reward. And you can see that the monkey is receiving a reward that has always, in the past, with 100% certainty, meant that a reward is about to arrive in the next few seconds. And it gets a spike of dopamine immediately it sees that visual stimulus. Interestingly, when the actual reward arrives, it was so predictable, there is no dopamine produced. Dopamine is all about anticipating. When the monkey sees a stimulus that has never been associated with a reward, in other words, zero probability that a reward is likely to arrive, you can see there's no dopamine produced when it sees the stimulus, the visual stimulus, but when the reward arrives, you do see a dopamine spike. The really interesting thing is when it sees a pattern which in the past, half the time has been associated with reward and half the time has not. Then we see a spike of dopamine when the visual stimulus arrives and a ramping up until the outcome is known. If you integrate over time, it means that uncertain rewards generate more dopamine in the reward system than either certain rewards or totally unpredicted rewards. So we love 50-50 chances. And that type of midbrain dopamine that's generated by games may help explain their engagement, but it also explains why games can be very good teachers, because midbrain dopamine also predicts learning. We think that this occurs via increased synaptic plasticity. There is more, the actual connections between the neurons are made in a more efficient way, so it speeds up the process of learning. And this increased synaptic plasticity happens beyond the midbrain regions, in the cortex, in various different regions. Now that means that games are incredibly good teachers, very good teachers, and it's taken us by surprise. But of course, it means that it can teach a variety of different things. And there is a downside to this. One of the things they can teach is effective response. And there is converging data that violent video games teach aggression. We see this in correlation studies, where violent gamers appear to be more aggressive, experimental studies, where non-gamers' aggression increases after playing these games, longitudinal studies in which aggression varies with game habits. But again, how much is a factor here, and it's worth saying. I'm not saying that people should never play these games, but one should keep an eye on how much. And also a neurophysiological desensitization. So if you've been playing these games and you are confronted with images of real violence, your brain will produce a response which is desensitized, a less of a response basically when you see the scenes of real violence. But it all depends what you do with it. This is not the fact that gaming technology is bad. This is because it has been applied in a certain way. And we have exactly similar set of evidence to show that pro-social games teach empathy. And games that involve getting points for healing can actually teach their players to be pro-social and empathetic. So there is a decision, a moral decision, not about whether technology is good or bad, but about how we use it. So there is a case, I think, that we should continue to work as hard as we can to make sure we're providing information about what I call digital hygiene for users, parents, developers, and schools, about what sorts of uses of technology are a benefit and which sorts of uses of technology may present some hazards. But certainly there is not a case for the type of hysteria that newspaper headlines often try to generate. It's the same science and the same technology that generates potential for hazard and potential for benefit. Yes, there are some hazards we need to be aware of, addiction and aggression, perhaps, but the benefits arise from exactly the same processes, benefits such as learning new skills, pro-social behavior, and immense educational potential. What we need to do now is understand more about the science to make sure that we fully exploit technology for human benefit.
Let's start with this issue of what you said about games. It seems to me that this has massive implications for education, and that thus far when we've talked about the schooling, the way in which we've talked about the role of the internet and the online world in relation to schooling, it's been pretty peripheral. How much work is going on in that space, and what's your kind of hunch as to how radical it might be in terms of the way in which we've changed the ways in which we think about young people learning?
Well, I think for decades, researchers, educators, and entrepreneurs have been trying to produce educational learning games, and it's been something of a complete failure in many respects. It has been called a complete failure. I'm not sure I'd be that harsh, but clearly there's been a problem, and one of the problems has been that we haven't really had a theory to guide it. We don't really understand games. We don't understand how they engage. And therefore, to try to combine that with learning is actually very problematic. And one of the interesting things is that although many of the attempts have involved very sophisticated graphics and really very wonderful technology, I think the very principle of gaming in terms of why we find it enjoyable and how it helps us learn has been left out. And I think that neuroscience has an awful lot to offer there.
But the incentives, the way in which the technology works with learning is not to do with a specific characteristic of the technology. That's to do with what helps us to learn. I mean, I could take it from your evidence, for example. Because she has a terrible life being my PA, I buy my PA a bunch of flowers every Monday morning, but it suggests to me she would get more pleasure if I bought them once every 2 weeks in a rather random way, in order that the dopamine release would be better. I'm going to explain this to her tomorrow. But
yeah. I mean, essentially, you're right.
This isn't a function of technology. This occasional reward thing is something that is characteristic of all.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Because one of the things we've tried to do, I'm deviating slightly in towards another project that I'm involved with, but we've been trying to test this out in a classroom to find out if it's actually true that giving uncertain reward engages children more. And we found that it does seem to be the case. I mean, it began for me when the children were arguing about who was going to sit in the front seat of the car, and I found that by tossing a coin, they were much happier with the outcome, and it became something that they actually enjoyed, and usually we'd have lots of arguments. So what we did was to ask children whether they would prefer to have their question from Mr. Certain, who would give them a point if they got it correct, or Mr. Uncertain, who'd toss a coin, they get 2 points or no points. And the preference for having their rewards and asking their questions from Mr. Uncertain rose throughout the maths lesson. But it's particularly, it has to be said amongst boys, so you might have to be a little bit careful of that issue. I think there probably is a strong gender effect here. We've been telling children, we've been telling teachers, Ofsted have been telling people for a long time that motivation is all about reward consistency. If a child knows the answer, they should have the point, basically. But no, they would be more engaged and more motivated if by getting the right answer, they have a chance to win a point. That is more engaging.
What about one of the consistent concerns that people have expressed about technology, and particularly technology in young people? Zimbardo, for example, gave a lecture on this subject, which is the impact on attention spans. And you talked about these reward systems, but is it the fact that the reward has to come very quickly? And what does that do to our impact for genuine delayed gratification? Now, in the video games, the feedback mechanisms are very, very fast. It's not work hard and then after three quarters now we'll tell you whether you've done well. So what's the state of play on this notion that the online world and the gaming world reduces our capacity for deferred gratification beyond a few seconds?
I mean, I certainly would never suggest that gaming in a classroom should substitute for the ability to hold one's attention in a fixed way, whilst reading a book. I think that's very important. Whether technology actually damages that ability, I think is very moot. It certainly wouldn't be appropriate to say that we have evidence, for example, that playing lots of video games causes ADHD. If, however, you were going to say, but can it disrupt behavior in the classroom simply because the child has got something more interesting to do, they'd rather get home and do, and they're now finding the lesson rather boring because they've got a very exciting video game at home. Yes, I think that is true, and in fact there's a good study that shows that, whereby they took...
so in a way, it's not technology's fault, it's reality's fault.
It's reality's fault.
Because reality can't get as improved as quickly as the technology.
Exactly. The fact is they are very engaging, and they gave children video games that had never experienced them, and after 6 months, compared with the group who hadn't got the video games, their literacy levels had dropped and their behavior in class had dropped as well. But then you don't know that wouldn't have been exactly the same result if you'd given them a pony or something else that was really exciting and engaging for when they got home. And let's face it, yes, you're right. I mean, this is a reality issue. They're here. We are competing with these machines, and we need to understand why they're such good fun so that we can take those processes and apply them in the classroom and have lessons that are just as exciting.
I remember someone saying to me that if you're a great teacher, you will always beat games because there's something about the passion and the connection that you will have. But it's a pretty miserable future for you if you're a mediocre teacher, because the gap between what you can do and what can be done online is going to grow ever bigger. If the real, if the non-online can't add value to the online experience, it's going to be increasingly finding itself pushed to the margin.
Well, I mean, one of the approaches that we've been trying out lately has been a whole class gaming experience. So you're teaching and learning entirely through gaming using technology. And in fact, it's been so successful with children that I now teach postgraduate neuroscience using the same method for half the unit. And I was expecting them to be up in arms about it, but they love it, it's great. And I'm a fairly mediocre teacher. So I think, I think there is chance for us, I think there's hope for us.